Well, welcome to the Trainers Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision making. The purpose of the Trainers Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainers Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainers Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Professor Mark Williams. Professor Williams is a world-leading authority on the topic of perceptual cognitive expertise and expert performance across domains. He has published almost 300 journal articles in peer-reviewed outlets in numerous fields, including cognitive science, experimental psychology, neuroscience, sports science, and medicine. Professor Williams has also written 20 books, almost 100 chapters, 60 professional articles, and over 100 journal abstracts, and has delivered around 300 keynote and invited lectures in 32 different countries. He has worked in some of the top universities in the UK, Australia, and the United States, as well as in a leading nonprofit research institute, the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. He has served as the head of the department in the UK at Brunel University, London, Australia, the University of Sydney, and the United States for the University of Utah, as well as in the role of Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the University of Sydney. Professor Williams is the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Sports Science, Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport, and the Journal of Human Movement Science. He has sat on the editorial boards of the Scandinavian Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport, Frontiers of Cognition and Frontiers in Psychology, Performance Science, and the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology, and he has acted as a guest editor for special issues of the Journal of Sports Science, Journal of Motor Behavior, Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology, Neuropsychologica, and Journal of Experimental Psychology Applied. Dr. Williams, welcome to the Trainers Bullpen, and thank you for making the time to talk to us today.
Yes, my pleasure, Chris. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very warm introduction there. I'm looking forward to chatting away around some of the issues that are of interest to you and your audience.
Yes, well, so am I. And so a little bit of background about you, and I mentioned this in the introduction before I hit record, but you don't know this, but I've been stalking you since 2019 when I got a hold of a copy of this book called Anticipation and Decision Making in Sport that you were the editor of, and this was published by Routledge Press in 2019. Yep. And as I struggled, Mark, to really begin to understand better ways in which to take an evidence-based approach, a human factors-based approach to training law enforcement officers for great performance in those rapidly unfolding, ambiguous, and high-consequence domains that our officers operate in. Your book and your subsequent research that I've been, like I say, stalking you from afar has been massively influential in helping me reform and refine my training to make it more evidence-approached. But I reached out to you, Mark, because you popped up on LinkedIn and you were posting these articles on LinkedIn or these thoughts that you called myths of learning. And as I saw that, I'm like, oh, that sounds provocative, myths of learning. So, well, why don't we start there? What led you to want to do this series? You did a whole series on the myths of learning. Were you just trying to be provocative, Mark, or what drove you to do
no,
that?
I don't think I set off necessarily to be provocative, although I guess in the back of my mind I did think that some people would probably find the content more provocative than others. I mean, I guess my main rationale was that we live in a society where information is easy to access, and LinkedIn is one of those sources where lots of people post on it. And a lot of what's posted goes relatively unchallenged. And I think it's probably difficult for certainly lay people to know, what is authentic and who is an expert in any particular domain. And I guess there were a lot of posts on there that sort of highlight some issues, and I thought, well, actually, the evidence doesn't really support that. And I started off, I guess, thinking of maybe just 2 or 3 areas that I'd specifically seen posts on in LinkedIn that I wanted to try and address. But I guess once I got into a rhythm, having initially set off to just post a couple of myths, I kind of thought, well, I might as well keep going. So let's do a week. And then after I'd done a week, I think I added 1 or 2 others on at some later date. So I may return with some more when the mood takes me. But yes, I mean, I think the information presented for me synthesizes what I think the science tells us about some of those areas that we're focused on. And there are such a lot of myths in society, and I guess social media allows those myths to be perpetuated pretty quickly across the globe.
Absolutely. And well, as I read those articles, that series that you wrote on LinkedIn, I immediately thought in my mind of those myths are often very prevalent, I guess you could say, in my domain, which is law enforcement training as well. So I thought, what a great thing to reach out to you and see if you'd be willing to come on the Trainers Bullpen to talk about some of these myths and why they are. But maybe more importantly, once we dispel the myth, is then how do we correctly understand what is the right approach and how should trainers think about creating good, productive learning environments for our people. So we're going to start
I should probably comment as well that once I'd written the myths, I thought to myself, there's probably a book in there somewhere just focusing on myths and clarifying what is true and less true in terms of the science and its application.
Absolutely.
There's definitely a podcast in there for sure.
Yeah,
So,
well, and here we
let's
are.
see how we
We're
get
at
on
we're
to
at one
discussing some of
podcast.
these myths. Yes.
Exactly. And I don't think in this one podcast we're going to anywhere near get through all of those learning myths that you put out. So who knows, I may have to bug you to continue to do a series of those after this. And then you can take the content from the podcast and just publish it as a book. Your work is already
Yes.
done.
Get someone to type it up.
Exactly. So here we go. So the first myth we're going to start with is I'm going to read the statement that you put out. You said there's no such thing as the 10,000 hour rule. All right. So over to you. Defend your thesis, Professor.
Yes. So where the notional 10,000 hour rule came from, or 10-year rule as it's also been called, is that a colleague of mine who sadly passed away a few years ago, very eminent cognitive psychologist called Anders Ericsson, did some work in the early 90s where they looked at the developmental history profiles of groups of musicians of varying skill levels at a music academy in Berlin. And what they found was that the highest level of musicians in the group had typically accumulated around 10,000 hours of practice by the time they reached the peak of their profession. And subsequent to that, there were probably a couple of other studies that also seemed to come up with this 10,000 hour. And I guess it then led to Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers, picking this up and generalizing to create this 10,000 hour rule. So it wasn't Anders Ericsson that came up with this 10,000 hour rule or 10-year rule. It was Malcolm Gladwell's interpretation of the work of Ericsson and others. But the reality of it is that what the first thing that Ericsson was trying to convey is the fact that he actually suggested that experience on task is not necessarily strongly correlated with performance. And what he argued was that deliberate practice, which is specific, purposeful practice with the intention of improving some specific aspect of performance, is what is generally correlated with performance. So I think we need to clarify that as well. But ultimately, since then, there have obviously been a lot of studies that have been done across a variety of different domains. And really, the number of hours that you need to become an expert in any domain really depends on how popular that domain is and when engagement begins in that domain. So, for instance, if you want to play soccer in a World Cup, for instance, then soccer is an immensely popular sport globally. Obviously, in some countries more than others, but places like Europe and Brazil, kids start playing at about 4, certainly 6 years of age, and often they're in Europe anyway, a formal training academy by 6 or 8 years of age. Now, in that sport, in order to reach the elite level, then probably 10,000 hours is not enough. It's probably the case that by the time these players get to 20 years of age, they probably will have accumulated 20,000 hours or more. So that is a very popular sport culturally. It's a sport that's heavily reliant on technical and tactical ability and ball mastery. So hours of practice, and of course deliberate practice in particular, are crucial in terms of the development of expertise. But I mean, even in sports that are less popular, for instance, arguably, let's say rowing, then rowing is not as popular generally as soccer globally, and people begin to engage in the sport much later. And it's probably typically the case that in that sport, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 hours of practice is sufficient in order to become an elite performer. So it's really task dependent. And the two things that are important, I guess, is relative to whoever you're competing against. And I guess this is not just sport, of course. It could also be law enforcement. It could be war fighting. You need to make sure that you've accumulated more practice hours than them, ideally deliberate practice hours. And it's not just the quantity either, of course. It's also the quality of that practice that is equally important. So there isn't such a thing as a 10-hour rule. But clearly practice, particularly high quality practice, deliberate practice, is crucial to the development of expertise. But the actual hours needed to reach the elite level in any particular domain are really domain specific. And it typically depends on the classical duration for training within that domain as to who is expert or not.
Okay. So with you gave, I think, a very brief definition of deliberate practice, and
Yeah.
I didn't get it all down. You said it was a specific intentional practice. So can you maybe dive, like, what is deliberate practice? In other words, if say you were to walk into my law enforcement training domain, if I'm teaching combatives or
Yeah.
firearms or something like that, how would you know by looking at my practice environment, is this deliberate practice or is it not? Like, what are the
Well,
markers of deliberate practice?
yeah. I mean, some scientists have used more lay terms to differentiate between practice and deliberate practice, for instance. So we can also talk about maintenance practice and growth practice. Now, maintenance practice is the concept that you continue to practice skills that are well developed and you've already mastered particularly well. And clearly, we don't know exactly, but it's inevitable that some degree of maintenance training is probably a requirement to retain skills over time. But then the concept with growth practice is that you then have to identify what your weaknesses are and what areas need to be improved upon, ideally based on empirical data if it exists, so that you can then design practice sessions to optimally grow or develop the skills that need developing. And Erickson actually suggested that a lot of non-experts, they suffer from arrested development in the sense that once they can perform a task reasonably well, then they settle for that. And then most of the practice they engage in after that is maintenance practice. Whereas experts, because they have the growth mindset, are more likely to identify specific practice areas that need to be improved on and to accumulate more hours in deliberate practice or growth practice so that they continue to develop on the learning curve and to become more skilled over time.
Okay, so is then, like, you use the example of like soccer as an example
Yeah.
of a tactical sport, and then you gave the example of rowing, which seems to me, I mean, I've only watched rowing, I've never done it, but it seems to me to be much less probabilistic and
Yes.
complex than a soccer task, which requires, there's a whole bunch of ambiguity, movement,
Yeah.
perception, decision making. So is that the idea then of Like when you talk about the difference between the tactical and non-tactical environment, would deliberate
Yeah.
practice be more critical for those domains that require that probabilistic type of tactical performance then?
I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that deliberate practice is limited to technical and tactical skill development. It's essentially a case of, for every performer, identifying what the weaknesses and the strengths of that individual is, and ensuring that we design practice sessions that work on the weaknesses and provide that opportunity to stress the system and for growth and development to actually occur. I suppose what it is that what you find in a lot of the sports, particularly that have a high technical and tactical component. So I can think of soccer, I can think of basketball, tennis, golf. These are generally sports where early engagement, not necessarily early specialization, but certainly early engagement in the sport is important, because you need to accumulate a sufficiently large number of hours in order to be able to develop these technical and tactical skills over time. Whereas arguably a lot of the sports that are maybe based on physiological characteristics, maybe a lot of those skills are more likely to be transferable per se. And therefore the hours accumulated in those sports are generally lower. So I think the cultural popularity of each sport is crucial in terms of the typical model of development within that sport or domain.
Okay, that makes sense. You just used a term there. You said that they're more transferable. So can you just explain that? Because I think that that is an important concept as we need to understand it in law enforcement. So the transferability of skill to the criterion environment, to the street environment that officers operate in. So when you're talking about transferability of skill, can you discuss that? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, let me just go back and think about law enforcement first and foremost. Um, I'm assuming it's a professional domain where not many people grow up, I don't think, at 6 and 7 years of age and want to be a law enforcement officer or a warfighter or any other of these typical professional domains in many ways. So I guess usually specialization into the domain occurs later in life, certainly
Mm.
late teens, early 20s perhaps. So I guess the hours that are necessary to be accumulated to become an elite performer in that domain is clearly going to be a lot less than the hours that are accumulated in a high performance sport domain because of that early specialization model. So I mean that's one thing to sort of bear in mind. I mean, clearly I do also appreciate that law enforcement officers can serve for 3 or 4 decades. So clearly there is a relative variation in the amount of experience that is accumulated in there. But as I said, it's not necessarily experience per se, but it's hours accumulated within that growth practice phase or the deliberate practice that is more causally associated with performance per se. Yeah, coming back to your specific question, the issue of what transfers is a little bit vague in the literature. There's a lot of anecdotal, intuitive evidence, of course, that people say, well, I used to play this when I was young and that's helped me. There are skills that transfer into other domains. But the empirical evidence, the scientific evidence around transfer is actually fairly limited. The only thing we know is that transfer is more likely to occur if two tasks share similar characteristics or have what's called identical processing or similar elements, similar components and characteristics to the task. But we don't know exactly what those characteristics might be or how much engagement in another domain is needed in order for transfer to be facilitated. And most of the work actually, so I'm not saying transfer doesn't occur, but as scientists, we don't quite know exactly what transfers and how do we optimally facilitate that transfer. And I would say, however, that I don't think that most of the research evidence is quite strong in highlighting that the most important thing about expertise is specificity of practice, and that, you know, the more deliberate practice that you accumulated in that specific domain of expertise, the more knowledge, the more skills you acquire, and that's what effectively transfers. So I don't think the amount of transfer that occurs is going to be pivotal for the development of expertise in the target domain. So I wouldn't necessarily plan for transfer. As I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that transfer doesn't occur. I mean, I can evidently think of arguably people who have served in the military, for instance, may have developed skills and competencies that may help them in the law enforcement situation. I mean, certainly some skills are evident, aren't they? I mean, for instance, shooting a gun. I would imagine that that's pretty much the identical task. If you're the process of just firing a gun at a stationary target, whether you're in the military or the law enforcement, it's pretty much the same. So that's clearly going to transfer. I mean, when you get to the other end of dealing with perpetrators, potential criminals, then clearly it's not quite the same as the military warfighting context. It doesn't mean that there may not be some components of transfer, but clearly the amount of transfer and the degree of the transfer is not going to be as great as hours accumulated within the law enforcement situation.
On those specific tasks
On
is
those
what you're
specific tasks, yes. Yes.
Right. So, you know, one thing that occurred to me, I'm recalling back when I used to be an academy instructor and looked after the academy for my agency, is Mark, we would have a class of, say, 24 recruits that we would have them for 5 months to 6 months through the academy. And what we noticed as trainers is that if we had students who came from a sporting background, particularly where they were involved in some type of ballistic motor movement contact sports, their ability, their natural, their proprioception, their balance control, their ability to move fluidly under resistance was visually markedly better than those recruits who had no background in those types of sports. So, I mean, that's just anecdotal, but is that possible? So is what we were seeing there, would that then be transfer? Like, are we seeing just the capabilities of even just their motor ability and their proprioception to transfer from those domains into the combative domain in law enforcement?
I mean, the evidence for that, I think, would be mostly anecdotal. I mean, there wouldn't be any scientific evidence to, I think, necessarily explain that. I mean, as I said, the extent of the scientific knowledge is the more comparable two tasks are, the more they share processing properties and elements, then the more likely there is to be transfer. But that seems a very far level of transfer from the kinds of tasks that you've articulated there to law enforcement, for instance. I mean, I certainly think, thinking again about the transfer, because I'm assuming that the path from the military to law enforcement is reasonably well trodden, so to speak. And as I said before, I mean, certainly the ability to handle firearms, I would think, has a lot of commonality, if not being practically identical across the two domains. I mean, there are probably other skills that may transfer as well, of course. I mean, there's sort of dealing with pressure, dealing with confrontation, dealing with a threat to life, are things that most of these military recruits will have experienced in warfighting scenarios, and there may be some transferable components in that regard. I mean, I guess in theory, transfer can occur at different levels. The transfer can be physical, physiological, technical, tactical, psychological. And the evidence is equally not tremendously strong across any of those areas. On a personal level, I can certainly see that maybe psychological skills are more likely to transfer than technical and tactical skill. I mean, for instance, if you're a tennis player, you know, being able to play a sort of cross-court forehand drive or a backhand slice shot aren't really skills that you need in a law enforcement situation.
Right.
But dealing with pressure, being resilient, being mentally tough, are arguably characteristics that are quite helpful in a range of different domains. And even things like communication, teamwork, interactions, which are developed in the sports domain, I could conceivably see that they would transfer to provide positive attributes in a law enforcement warfighting scenario. But I suppose the gist of the whole conversation here is that our evidence of what exactly transfers isn't particularly strong, and really more evidence is needed to ascertain what actually transfers and how much exposure to those other tasks is needed for that transfer to be facilitated. And is the transfer more beneficial than just more hours of practice in the same domain of expertise? So there aren't really clear answers on that. But then a lot of people talk as if there are, but really when you look at the data, it's just not clear.
Okay, so the idea of this deliberate practice then is you saying, this is what you say in your article, is a focus on improving weakness and developing new skills. So performers need to be suitably challenged during practice to facilitate development. And you used the term growth mindset earlier in this conversation. So that then, all of that, does that then not presuppose that the environment, if I'm actually focusing on my weaknesses as a law enforcement officer or as a trainer, I want my people to recognize their weaknesses and be able to be in those environments and grow from them. That to me presupposes then that it is an environment where there is going to be pressure to perform in those areas of weakness, and my students are going to make mistakes and have errors as they learn to grow from their weaknesses. Like, have I misunderstood that, or how else do we grow if we're not making mistakes?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I guess a couple of points. I mean, firstly, of course, then if we can have empirical data to try and identify specific weaknesses that need to be worked on, then that's better. If not, of course, then we have to rely on subjective opinion as to what are these individual strengths and weaknesses. But then we need to be able to design practice sessions that allow them to work on those weaknesses. And we need to provide the right level of instruction and intervention. So clearly one of those is that you do need to create an environment where the task is sufficiently difficult in order to stimulate growth. So you need to create a challenge point or a level of desirable difficulty. And of course, inevitably, you want that to be high enough so it stresses the system. And by definition, that's going to lead to failure on occasions. But failure really is an opportunity to grow. It's an opportunity to think, well, I didn't quite get that right. What might I do differently next time so that I might improve my chances of doing better on subsequent attempts? That trial and error learning and continually stressing the system. And when I say stressing the system, of course, I mean, again, that could be physical, physiological, technical, tactical, emotional, psychological, all of those factors. I mean, clearly the challenge that you have in a law enforcement situation is it must be very difficult to have significant amounts of exposure to practice, because probably a lot of the exposure occurs on job. And therefore you don't really want people to fail in the work environment. Or if you want them to fail, you want them to fail on tasks that are not certainly going to have a risk in terms of human life. But again, I suppose that's not always possible, which is why maybe simulation, VR environments do offer some advantages in that regard, of course, in the sense that through those simulated environments, you are able to recreate dangerous intervention situations and arguably increase the level of difficulty of the task and challenge the learner to respond to those. And clearly, if the learner gets it wrong, then you give them another attempt, or you manipulate the task and give them more feedback to focus on that. Whereas in a real world situation, of course, sometimes you don't get another go, do you? If you get it wrong.
Yeah, one of the mantras that we have in law enforcement training is we'd rather have you fail in training than fail on the street, because that's what the learning environment is for an opportunity for you to explore the limits of your performance, find those areas where you need to grow and excel, and be able to fail forward in the training environment. So because to your point, failing on the street means you may not get a do-over again if you fail out there, or there could be disastrous consequences. So,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, just picking up on your point there, Chris. I mean, for me, the three most important words in regards to the training environment is firstly specificity, and in essence, what I mean by that is that your practice environment needs to mimic as best as possible the demands of the performance environment. And as I said, that could be physical, physiologically, technically, tactically, emotionally. So creating environments that for law enforcement officers that matches as best as possible what they experience on the streets is obviously important. So specificity is one word. The other one is repetition, of course. And repetition is repeated attempts at that task under those or similar conditions. And then what you have therefore constantly is the demand between repetition and specificity, in the sense that in sports, for instance, coaches are usually able to create specific training environments that match the competition environments relatively easily, although they still have the balance between repetition and specificity. The highest level of specificity, of course, is in the match play situation, but then repetition of incidences are quite low there. So what coaches normally do is they probably lose a little bit of specificity in the practice environment in order to create high levels of repetition. And we have the same thing here with the use of simulated environments. I mean, whether they're acted out scenarios or whether they're film-based simulations or whether they're VR-based simulations. Again, the plus points of those is they do present opportunities for high levels of repetition. But then the specificity is not quite, of course, the real world situation. So you have that balance out there between the two. The third key word is what I spoke about before, is difficulty, and being able to set the appropriate level of difficulty for the learner to be able to grow from those experiences and learn new skills and challenge themselves to develop.
excellent. And so, yeah, the appropriate level of difficulty, you talked about desirable difficulties, and that leads us right into this idea, which was the next myth that I want to talk about. And you said pressure, the myth is pressure has a negative impact on performance. And so first, maybe before you get into that myth and why it's a myth, can you unpack a little bit? Because I'm still confused around the relationship between two terms, and that is stress and pressure. Yeah. And I often see when I read the different books and the different research papers is these terms thrown around synonymously, and then I'll read other ones where they make a clear distinction between what pressure is and what stress is, so that we have the ground rules for this conversation. What do you mean when you say pressure or stress?
Well, for me, I mean, there are a variety of different stressors that a performer could be exposed to. I mean, clearly, anxiety can be a stressor, lack of sleep, being cold or warm, having not eaten, are all stressors per se, in that they arguably stress the system. And well, I mean, of course, there's a lot of research evidence now that has manipulated these different stressors, and they do find that they change performance. It's not always negative. So, for instance, what tends to happen is that as the level of stress, well, let me talk about anxiety, because that's probably one of the stressors that is most prevalent in sport or law enforcement situations, is that as the level of anxiety increases, the system is able to cope for that, because what happens is we devote more resources, more mental effort, more focus on the task. But then as the anxiety continues to develop, then we have no more spare mental resources to devote to the task. So at that point, potentially, performance can decline. So therefore, some degree of stress, for instance, probably improves performance by and large. So you only get a decrement in performance if the extent of the stress exceeds the amount of spare resources or capacity that we have to be able to devote to the task. Then you start to get a decline in performance. So in the literature, there are theories that differentiate between processing efficiency and performance effectiveness. So if you like, as you become more stressed, effectiveness stays the same, but efficiency declines. But there becomes a point where the stress goes so high that you then start to get a decline both in efficiency and in effectiveness. But that is only really at relatively high levels of stress. And that is obviously performer dependent in terms of how that individual perceives that stress and creating pressure, and of course the amount of resources and skills and expertise that the performer has to devote to coping with that pressure in the first instance.
So that relationship that you were just describing there, Mark, between the you spoke about a necessary stress or anxiety that is required, but then at a certain point it becomes negative. Is that what has historically been referred to as the Yerkes-Dodson relationship between stress arousal and performance, or is that something different that you're talking about here? Because in law enforcement, we talk a lot about the Yerkes-Dodson and the catastrophe theory of anxiety and performance. Is that relationship the same?
I mean, clearly that's the classic inverted U model of performance, and there is some of that, although there are more nuanced models of guess that suggest that it depends on the nature of the stressor that's imposed. I mean, what we do know is that stress changes the way that we process information. So we've done a lot of work, for instance, and we find that under high levels of anxiety per se, there's a change in the gaze behaviors. And for example, normally in a law enforcement situation, it depends on the exact nature of the task and the situation, but normally, for instance, I'm going to guess that you would, an educated guess, that the law enforcement officer would have more fixations of shorter duration when they get more anxious. That is probably either to some degree of hypervigilance or some degree of narrowing of the peripheral visual field that stops them from using peripheral vision more. So we've certainly found that in sports like karate, where under low anxiety, performers fixate centrally on the head and the chest, and they use peripheral vision to scan where the attack is coming from. But when they get more anxious, there is an increase in the number of fixations to peripheral areas of the display. We also know that experts are more likely, when you go into a scenario, for instance, a law enforcement scenario, and you've got a potential perpetrator in front of you, you may walk into a warehouse, for instance, and you see an unidentified suspect there, and you ask the suspect to provide some ID. Now, clearly, as the subject reaches into the back pocket, what the officer is able to do there is pick up what we call postural information from the body shape of the perpetrator, in the sense of maybe the speed and the urgency with which he or she is moving the body and moving the hand back towards the wallet. So there's information immediately available from the body shape and movements of the perpetrator, potential perpetrator. Plus there is a much broader pattern recognition information in terms of the scenario. You know, there may be more than one perpetrator in there, and the orientation of those, where are they stood, creates some patterns and structure and meaning to that environment. Plus, of course, you have a higher level contextual information. So you probably had an audio recording that's come down into the car, the patrol car, on the way to the scene, which tells you that the suspects are expected to be armed, and there may be several of them. So whatever the context is, you provided with higher level contextual probabilistic information, which you then start to hypothesize about what it is that you may see in those situations. And what we find actually is that when people become anxious, they become less effective at using that higher level probabilistic contextual information, and they tend to rely more on postural information. And the reason being for that is that picking up postural information is what we call biological motion processing, and actually we developed those skills very early. So they're low in terms of attentional load and low in terms of cognitive load. So when anxiety is using up resources, cognitive, mental, attentional resources to cope with the anxiety, you have less resources to devote to the task. So then you simplify the information you use, rightly or wrongly, and you focus more so on this postural information and less so on the more higher level cognitive information, that clearly may be important in those scenarios as well.
Okay, well, that's really interesting what you just said, because as you're talking, I thought immediately of a eye tracking study that Dr. Joan Vickers and Dr. Bill Lewinsky did with police officers, where they had an individual who would rapidly turn towards them and either would present a handgun or would present a non-threatening item such as a cell phone.
Yeah.
And they put a whole bunch of officers, from junior officers all the way through frontline officers and up to experienced counter-terrorist officers.
Yeah.
And what they noticed in the eye tracking, Mark, was that the officers who failed to pick up in the no-shoot condition, their eye tracking pattern was exactly what you described it as. As the scene escalated and became more stressful, their gaze was massively scattered, or they didn't put their gaze. They had no fixations of actually on meaningful information in the scene, compared to the expert officers who were categorized as experts. Their gaze pattern, they had specific quiet eye fixations on certain points, and those points were areas of the scene where not only was relevant information occurring now, but they actually put their eyes on areas of the scene where the threat was then next going to appear. So they were actually anticipating the future evolution. And just as you were talking about that, because the novices, what they shot on was based on the biomechanics or the kinematics of the subject when he turned. So I think that's exactly what you're talking about there, is they made the decision to shoot based on the body posture that was presented rather than actually on the relevant information in the scene.
Yeah, that's right. Although I guess there's two components here. Skill has an impact on that, but so does pressure. And I guess what's also interesting is that most of the studies have only manipulated a single stressor at any one time. So that more often than not, the two that have been manipulated most often are anxiety and physiological workload, physiological fatigue, for instance. But clearly in the real world situation, particularly warfighting, maybe even more so than law enforcement, often these guys are under significant amounts of pressure from different stressors simultaneously. So they're anxious because of the fear of life. They may not have eaten or slept for a few days. They might be cold and wet, or hot and sweaty, and all of those stressors are using up processing resources. And I think what the experts become better at, of course, is optimizing how they allocate the resources that they have specifically towards the task. So in a very simple example, for instance, if your life is at risk, of course, you're not going to be worrying too much about the fact that you've not eaten dinner that night. So there's some prioritization that goes. But I guess we're coming back to the specificity of the practice environment, so in the sense that in order to learn how to cope with those different sources of pressure, then clearly they have to have that experience of being in those similar situations and having multiple stressors placed on them in those practice environments, so that they can play around, if you like, with how they best handle that strategy and that stress and what strategies they need to develop so that they can perform effectively in those kinds of environments. And again, this is, I think, where maybe simulation has some advantages, of course, because invariably, if in law enforcement, those highly stressful situations probably don't come about too often, thankfully. Certainly probably less often than they do in a warfighting context. So the question is, how do they accumulate that experience without actually being in the firing line? Or, of course, ideally what you'd like to do is progressively increase the level of stress that they're exposed to in the firing line. But that's very hard to control, because I guess in many instances you don't know what may happen or may not happen in any law enforcement situation. The level of pressure could elevate very quickly. So I suppose the challenge is when you've got officers in those situations who haven't had the opportunity to experience and to practice how they cope with those stressors, then clearly they're going to be disadvantaged relative to those who have been in those types of situations before. Maybe that's why I highlighted earlier on that maybe there may be some element of positive transfer from warfighting to law enforcement, because with a lot of warfighters, they've been on the battlefield, they maybe served tours of duty, they know what the pressure feels like in those situations, and they maybe at least had some opportunity to explore how they best deal with those different stressors.
Right. So is that something then? Because one of the phrases that we often hear is this idea of stress inoculation, and so when we think of like military war fighters or people who have a lot of experience in pressure environments, does that so I'm just thinking about, that ability you spoke about, the importance of experts have the ability to allocate resources appropriately and their attentional resources. And so is that an important relationship then? So when we think about training specificity, like it isn't just doing the thing physically, right? It's the whole psychological milieu as well, right? Building that resilience. So training specificity also must include aspects of not just the physical, like you said, but also the psychological.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different ways of kind of looking at this, I guess. I mean, one is the one that I articulated a minute ago, is this concept of creating practice environments where people are exposed to these kinds of stressors so that they can experience them and potentially find better ways to be able to cope with the pressure created in those environments. So that's one way, which is really based around the practice environment. I mean, the other question, of course, which is probably more one for an applied sports psychologist, but in the sense of whether there are various stress control techniques that officers can develop, for instance, breathing techniques that allow them to perceive the level of pressure that they're feeling in a more positive light, or not, that they downgrade it rather than upgrade it from a pressure perspective. So, I mean, certainly there are some psychological interventions that quite often a lot of elite athletes use to try and better control stress in those situations so that they perceive the stress as being less negative than others who don't have those skills. And then I guess the other interesting question is whether there are some broad psychological characteristics here. I'm pontificating a little bit here. Things like resilience, mental toughness, where people who score high on those characteristics are better able to perceive stress in a more positive light rather than negative light. And then the question then becomes, well, how do you develop grit, resilience, mental toughness in law enforcement officers? I mean, this is an interesting question in the sense there's a lot of cross-sectional research that has compared expert from less expert athletes. And typically what you find is that experts nearly always score higher on, those kinds of measures: perfectionism, grit, resilience, mental toughness. But what we don't know, of course, is do they come in scoring high on these kinds of attributes early on, or is it the environment and the training context and the performance environment that creates and develops these kinds of important psychological characteristics over time? What we really don't have is a lot of longitudinal research that tracks the development of these skills. But I think generally focusing on developing coping strategies, probably focusing on developing skills that may, psychological characteristics that may be important, like resilience, mental toughness, would again enhance their perception of the anxiety or the pressure as being less severe and more positive than negative per se, which therefore reduces the overall level of pressure. And then having them play around with how do they optimize the use of different resources that they have so that they can cope better in those environments, and what works for them and what doesn't work for them are, I think, probably strategies to kind of cope with those situations better.
And that perception of that anxiety is like would it be fair to say that if an officer felt that they had capability, competence, agency, and the ability to solve the problem that was presented to them versus an officer who felt that they did not have agency or control over it, they were out of control to solve this situation? Is that maybe like, because I'm trying to tie some principles together here, Mark, because I've been reading recently.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
pressure, we only perceive pressure, of course, when we feel that our capabilities to deal with the situation are going to be compromised. So if we have high levels of self-efficacy and we feel competent to deal with the pressure and to deal with that situation, then we're less likely to experience pressure in those situations, and it's less likely to have a negative impact on performance.
Okay, so
But
then,
maybe that's part of the benefits again of being able to practice coping strategies, practice performance strategies in those situations, and that the visor that you think you've been in that situation before, you dealt with it okay, so it means that you're more confident about being able to deal with it next time around.
right. So then the pressure environment that our people are learning in. So because you said earlier, or you said in your article, pressure can have a negative impact on performance, but it can also have a positive impact on performance. And so what I think trainers want to understand here is, okay, I get it. It's important. We think of training specificity, that the training environment should match as close as possible to the real environment. We want desirable difficulties. Got it. But then how much pressure is too much? Like, at what point in the learning environment as a trainer have I put too much pressure on my people and basically just crushed their confidence and their, you know what I'm saying? Like, is there a sweet spot?
Yeah.
What's the pressure sweet spot? And how would a trainer know the Goldilocks principles, right? Not too hot, not too
Yes.
cold.
Yes.
It's just right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, there's some science behind that, of course, in the differentiation between maintenance practice, growth practice, desirable difficulties, challenge points. But there is a craft to that to some degree as well, in that sense that, for instance, even that simple question, what's the optimal balance between maintenance practice and growth practice? Is it 50%, 50%? Is it 75, 20%, 25%? You know, we really don't know. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of research work that has identified that optimal balance. And in a similar way, I think that exists as well in terms of deciding what the optimal level of task difficulty is. Particularly in task environments which don't have a clear outcome measure of performance, then that becomes very hard. And there's also a lot of individual differences that are factored in here as well, in that, and coming back to some of these psychological characteristics again, like grit, resilience, mental toughness, maybe, and self-confidence, self-efficacy. Maybe if I score high on those measures, then perhaps it means that I can cope better with higher levels of growth practice, and perhaps I can cope better because I'm more resilient with not succeeding in those environments. So, you know, clearly there are going to be a lot of individual differences here across individuals, and that's something actually that we've not done a lot of research work on in the field of model learning historically. I mean, of course, over the last 40 to 50 years in model learning, our conclusions are really based on studies on groups of people. So, you know, we generalize. We have 20 participants who get this type of practice structure and 20 participants that get that types of practice structure. And then we statistically analyze them, and we found that this group has done better than that group. But we tended to have ignored the variability aspect of it. So questions like, well, do all 20 participants do better in this group, or is it only some of them that do? And if some don't do better, then why is that? Are there variances in some of these factors that I mentioned, grit, resilience, mental toughness, even IQ potentially. So we don't know enough, I don't think, about how individual differences impact on the efficiency of different types of training interventions.
Okay. One last thing I just want to touch on before we move on. I can't believe we've been going for almost an hour already. It's been great. But you say in under this idea of pressure and stress, you said high stress can lead to a reinvestment of cognitive effort on aspects of performance that have previously been automated, negatively impacting of performance. So that I underlined that because one of the things we strive for in law enforcement training, especially with our officers' tools, their equipment, their handguns, their tasers, whatever it might be that they're interacting with, we try to get that to a high level of automaticity, motor behavior. And so when I saw you write here that high levels of anxiety may impair previously automated behaviors, can you talk about what's happening there?
Yeah, well, I think as a progression of expertise is, for instance, we develop more fluid movements. So if I'm raising the gun, for instance, from my holster upwards, then I'm probably moving my shoulder, my elbow, my arm. I'm probably bending the knees. So I'm quite fluid in my movements. And of course, it's occurring automatically. So I'm not really thinking about it. It's something that I've done so many times that ultimately I'm just focusing on the outcome itself, which is pointing the gun in the right direction. But when we become anxious, one of the tendencies that happens is we tend to reinvest cognitive effort. We start thinking about what we're doing. And also at the same time, we can get freezing of degrees of freedom. So this fluid movement that you have in raising the gun from the holster, using the whole body, then becomes a much more rigid, because you're focusing on controlling the movement. So that happens a lot. It happens across a whole range of different domains in sport, even in older adults with a fear of falling, for instance, reinvest cognitive effort into the mechanics of walking. And the downside of that, of course, is all their effort goes on focusing on where they put their foot, where they don't really focus ahead of them as to what's coming towards them or things of that nature. So anxiety generally does cause us to reinvest effort in things that had previously become, through practice, automated.
Okay, so is what you just said, Mark, is that related to attention? Then is like that high stress level causes attention to go because where we want it in law enforcement is externally focused on what's happening, what's the threat, what's the problem.
Yeah.
And so
you
then
get a shift in focus of attention from a more externally focused attention, which normally occurs with expertise, to a more internally focused attention, focusing on the mechanics of what you're doing. That's why, of course, there's been a lot of evidence over the last couple of decades about the potential benefits of less explicit forms of instruction, in the sense of not providing too much instruction, not providing too much feedback, so that the focus is on the action effects externally and what it is you're trying to do, rather than the mechanics of the movement. And the research evidence shows that when people learn skills through more hands-off approaches to instruction, like guided discovery, for instance, rather than high levels of instruction and feedback, then people are less likely to reinvest cognitive effort through anxiety.
Okay, very good. That's helpful. And the third and last myth that we'll have for our time today, this is a great one. And I'll just read the myth first and then over to you. You wrote, here's the myth: good performance during practice infers that skill learning or that learning has taken place. So how can that be a myth? How could that possibly be a myth? You mean if I'm watching my people in practice and they're performing well, doesn't that mean that learning is taking place? Come on, Mark.
Well, performance is observed behavior. So when a law enforcement officer is performing on a simulator, for instance, or an athlete is performing in the practice environment, then what you are seeing is their performance. In order to make judgments as to whether learning is taking place, then you have to be able to measure retention. So is that change in performance carried over into subsequent practice sessions and, of course, to competition? And is there transfer? So does it transfer from practice to competition? So you need to be able to measure retention and transfer to make inferences about learning. So therefore, learning is not a short-term immediate thing. It's something that you make judgments on over a prolonged period of time. So the reason why this differentiation between performance and learning is interesting is that the evidence is quite strong, actually, in highlighting that if you want the best performance in a particular practice session, then it helps you if you provide lots of instruction, do specific block practice of a single skill, and provide lots of feedback. So then you get good performance. And then the myth here, of course, is that then when the instructor thinks, well, this guy's learning a lot, because look, his performance is great. But the reality of it is that the reverse conditions are actually better for long-term learning. So the question is, what is the least amount of instruction that I need to provide this performer so that they can begin practicing the tasks? To what extent are my practice conditions variable, random, and dynamic so that they reflect the demands of the actual performance environment? And that includes technical, tactical, physical, physiological, anxieties, all the different pressures that we spoke about before. And what is the least amount of feedback that I need to give the performer so that they can begin to process their own feedback? So those conditions have quite robustly been shown to enhance long-term transfer of skill and retention of skill under pressure. Because again, they're more hands-off approaches to instruction. And it means that the learner has more responsibility for his or her own learning and is able to develop knowledge in a much more implicit manner, so that when they have to perform in future under pressure, then they tend to perform better in that scenario. So it's a very, very difficult task for an instructor or a coach in many, many ways, actually. I mean, it's the most difficult job on the planet to some degree. So let me synthesize why. Because firstly, what you see is not necessarily what you get. So you may get performance in practice that looks great, but there may be that relatively little learning is occurring when you look at it systematically over time. Or the reverse scenario, of course, that performance is terrible in practice, but it doesn't mean that learning isn't taking place. So what you see is not what you get. And then add to that the complexity of what might be one individual's maintenance practice is another person's growth practice. So if you're working with groups of individuals, then how do you set the level of difficulty at the appropriate level so that each of these individuals has that opportunity to engage in growth practice? It's extremely difficult when you're training in groups. And of course, this individual differences in the way that learners respond to different types of interventions as well. So it's coaching is very difficult, and hence to some degree one of the things that I say all the time is that I deliver a lot of coach education workshops across a variety of different sports globally, and one of the things I always say at the start is, look, if you're expecting answers from me, you're going to be extremely disappointed, because I'm not going to give you answers. I'm not going to give you a recipe for coaching. So ultimately, my role is to try and enhance your professional knowledge and your broad understanding of how people learn. But then you've got to then integrate that professional knowledge into your craft knowledge as an instructor and a coach. So ultimately, coaching and instructing is an art form, but that art form can be informed by science. But it's not like a cooking recipe book. It's not that clear cut, I don't think, from an instructional perspective. There's also a lot of craft that goes into this process.
Sure, right. And I guess that's the art part of the art and science of being a great coach or a great instructor, is how you synthesize the principles of learning into your unique environment and like you said, especially if you've got a group of people, how then do you make sure that all of your people are in an appropriate condition for optimizing their learning. So
Yeah, well, let me give you a very practical example on that, perhaps, Chris. I mean, perhaps you're in a simulated, you're using a simulation environment, and then you're working with a law enforcement officer, and then you perceive, well, this level of task is too easy for this officer, so I've got to make the task a little bit more difficult, so that I'm challenging that individual, in other words, creating a level of desirable difficulty. So then, okay, how do I increase task difficulty? Well, there's lots of different ways I can do that. So if I provide less instruction to start with, arguably the task is going to be more difficult. If I increase the level of task difficulty itself by having more perpetrators, more things going on in the scene, for instance, then that makes it more difficult. If I do random variable practice rather than blocked for practice, using a variety of different scenarios rather than the same types of scenario, then that makes it more difficult. If I add different stressors, it makes it more difficult. If I provide less feedback, it makes it more difficult. So which one of those potential tools do I use to increase task difficulty for that officer? So it becomes, there's no guidance on that. Then it becomes a craft decision around, well, I think I'm going to try this, or I think I'm going to try that. It may be, of course, looking into the future, that if we use simulation extensively enough and we get large data sets on how individuals respond to different types of manipulations of difficulties that I mentioned, then we may be able to use AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning algorithms, so that the system actually determines how optimally to manipulate task difficulty for each officer. I can see that happening in 10 years' time, possibly, yes, if not sooner.
So just back to this paradox that you spoke about between, so if our people are practicing, if the practice environment is such that there's a rapid improvement in performance during the practice event, and then if we have a different practice event which is not blocked, but like you said, interleaved with variability, randomness, less feedback, but the performance doesn't get as high as, so, like we've got the two groups, right? We've got the practice group that's in that block kind of high performance, because this is what I want trainers to understand from you is,
correct,
because we have, we'll just be completely transparent here. We have in law enforcement predominantly a massive blocked training learning environment where we do focus on performance improvements during the learning event, whether that's shooting, combatives, defensive tactics, driving, whatever it is. So how do trainers then need to understand, do they not, that if they create an optimal learning environment for retention and transfer, that means performance during the training event won't look like it'll look ugly. It may look ugly.
It may look ugly, yes. So yes, I mean, in essence, as I said, if you're running a 1 hour training session, and these guys have got, I don't know, 6 or 10 simulations, however many they're facing over that 1 hour period, then if you want the best performance in that session, then as I said, provide lots of instruction, do block repetitive practice of similar skills, and provide lots of feedback. And they'll look as if they're learning, but the reality of it is that, as I said, reducing the amount of instruction, manipulating or increasing variability and randomness in the task scenario, and reducing feedback will lead to poorer performance. But then if the officers come back the next week, and they'll perform better. And if you give them scenarios that they did not experience previous week, which is arguably some measure of retention, although it's almost a near measure of retention, then they will do better. And arguably in the field situation, they will perform better, which is ultimately your main measure of transfer.
Okay,
yeah. So
excellent.
that differentiation between performance and learning, I think coaches need to be fully aware of it. And they need to think about what they're doing in those particular sessions. It's a funny one, because I don't know whether you get this in law enforcement, but in sport, of course, I mean, I think in terms of long-term athlete development, then the focus should mostly be on learning. But there are times, of course, where short-term performance is important. So, for instance, if I've got a big competition tomorrow, then the amount of learning that might occur between today's practice session and learning might be quite small. And maybe the key thing is that I perform well in today's practice session. So my level of self-confidence is high so that I feel prepared for tomorrow. So sometimes, certainly in sport, we need to focus on performance, but more often than not, we focus on long-term learning. Whereas I'm not sure whether that differentiation between performance and learning is quite so tangible in a law enforcement situation. Maybe the focus all the time there needs to be on long-term learning, because you never know when you have to perform.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we unfortunately don't have a psychic hotline we can phone to know when is our moment in the crucible going to be, and what's it going to look like when it does occur. So you're right. It may be weeks, months down the road when we're spontaneously thrust into an environment we didn't see coming, a high pressure environment rapidly unfolding where now we have to perform. So that's the world in which...
Invariably what will probably happen in those situations, Chris, if you put it into perspective here, is that the level of instruction, there's no instruction at the start. It'll probably be chaotic, random and variable, and you don't know what's going to happen. And the feedback ultimately is whether you're successful or not. So ultimately, these officers do have to perform in those environments without instruction and high levels of blocked repetitive practice. So you have to think of it in that way. You have to think about replicating the performance environment in the practice environment. And actually, for me, specificity is actually more important than repetition. I said to you, both are important. I mean, clearly it's the quantity and quality of practice argument again. I mean, both are important. Yes, we need a certain level of repetition, but the problem is if you have higher levels of repetition but low levels of specificity, then what are you actually practicing? Are you actually practicing skills that are going to transfer to the real performance situation? Whereas arguably, if I had to choose between the two, I'd go high specificity and low repetition, because at least I then know that whatever they're practicing is probably going to transfer, whereas the other way around doesn't work so well for me.
Yeah. Dr. or Professor Williams, that makes perfect sense. And that's I guess a great place where we can leave this interview, but you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your time, sir. And we've been speaking with Professor Mark Williams. Mark, is there anything that you would like to say in conclusion? And maybe could you, if any of our listeners want to reach out to you, because I know you should probably really enjoy getting tons of emails. So, but is there
Well,
any? Is there a way?
If anybody wants to connect, for sure, they're very welcome to. I'm obviously on LinkedIn, and if you just type Mark Williams Sports Science into Google, I'm sure you'll come across me. It was interesting chat, Chris. I guess we didn't get anywhere near as far in terms of the topics as we'd hoped, but happy to come on again at any stage in future if you want to pick up on some of the other issues that we didn't get to today.
I absolutely do, sir, and we will make that happen. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainers Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainers Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.